And now we have a chance to take some questions from the attendees this morning for Sharon or any of the earlier speakers that you heard about from Amanda. But let's keep those questions very focused so that we can get through as many as possible. I will start off with one that came in earlier from Dominique, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Forgive me if I'm not. And the question was, the aerial shows that there are ditches in low areas along the upland edge. Since, by definition, such areas are important larval habitats and will receive attention from control programs, how do we know that the ditching causes the low elevations? Causation versus correlation.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Did we start off with a lower elevation on the ditch side? I think the lead 210 accretion data really help us understand that process, and we do see that there are slower accretion rates on the ditched interior marsh especially. That is contributing to some extent that lower elevation that we're seeing.
Yeah, also there are ditches also in areas that are not close to the upland. We have ditches in the very middle of the marsh, and then 100 meters to the east there is area without ditches, and the elevation is completely different in the two areas. I mean, they look morphologically the same style of marsh, but the elevation is drastically different.
Okay, we have another question from Rachel Jakuba. Did you look at the trajectory of any of the ponds from 1938 aerials on the unditched side of the marsh?
Yeah, I've done something. I'll show you something briefly.
Okay, thanks, Julio. So we'll get to see that in a bit. I'll take the next question from Jennifer. While the ditched and unditched marshes seem to come to similar carbon accumulation rates, how does loss of carbon through increased erosion along those ditches contribute to carbon storage rates?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We were only able to use that transect closest to the tidal creek in the marsh interior. So that definitely is something that we're going to be incorporating, is the amount of carbon that we're losing by removing the sediment in these ditches. Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, and to add on to that, sharing your data are showing that we have contributions of old material, and some of that material that could be unearthed either by the ditching action itself, and as the water moves in and out of those ditches can bring some of that old sediment up onto the marsh surface. And that's probably contributing to, well, it is contributing to the vertical elevation and the vertical accretion rates.
Okay, I have a question from Vitali. What is an infilled pond and how are they filled in?
Sorry, I didn't define that. So yeah, we identified previous ponds on the ditch side of the marsh based on aerial photographs in 1920. And an infilled pond is one that is a recovered pond that has since infilled with material since the 1920s. So it's no longer a pond, it's basically recovered to the elevation of the surrounding marsh platform, and it's revegetated with salt marsh grasses. And that is what we would define as an infilled pond. And based on our Del 13C values, it looks like both infilled ponds and the surrounding salt marsh, the sources of organic carbon are from salt marsh plant biomass.
So Sharon, and how they infill is that when they connect to the channel network. So normally a pond is not connected to a channel. If a pond connects to a channel, then if the system has enough sediment and tidal range, like Barnstable, then the pond fill in with sediment, revegetate, and then accrete at 10 millimeters per year. So overwhelms sea level rise and eventually become a flush with the marsh.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Sharon and Julio. I'm going to go to the next question. So LeMay in 2007 found on the Great Marsh in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, that the fine sediments in the floodwaters were not deposited on the ditched marsh. The ditched marsh is 10 centimeters higher than the ditched, think there's a typo there. The ditch marshes tend to be higher than the ditch marsh. The same at Barn Island in Connecticut. So that was more of a comment than anything else. And that was from Ron.
I have another question. What is the age of the Barnstable Marsh? Understanding you saw a range in the surface biomass.
The age of the whole salt marsh?
3,000-4,000 years.
Yeah.
The Barnstable, sorry, the Redfield study, the classic one.
Julio.
Okay, we can go on to another one. Gabby, you can answer this. Are these ditches continuing to be maintained?
Sure, like I said, we're doing selective ditch maintenance to this day. So yes, some of them are being maintained, not all of them.
And also, R. Wolf asked, you know, if it might make sense if infill ponds recover. If these natural features prior to ditching were present, you're actually losing that open water pool habitat type, something for managers to consider. Absolutely, that was kind of a big part of the decision strategy. Like if you do ditches, you lose ponds. But that's definitely part of the trade-off. But if you don't want the mosquitoes, that's good. If you want ducks, maybe it's bad.
Yes. Okay. Thanks, Julio. Lori, were you?
I have another question. Is the increased accretion at the infilling pools organic matter or inorganic sediment?
We saw that it was organic matter dominated from salt marsh biomass.
I actually have another follow-up from Vitali. He was wondering if they were infilled naturally.
So yeah, that's a good question. We believe, you know, the ditches played an important role in the pond recovery on the ditch side. So the ditches are mimicking that natural tidal creek intersection process that happens with pond drainage, effectively draining the pond and allowing for revegetation of that mud flat.
Okay, I think we have time just for one more, but I see that we actually have quite a few more questions than we can get to right at this moment. But let's take this last one, and we're going to keep these other ones for our speakers to answer later, even if it's after the webinar. Would there be value in comparing ditches that are no longer maintained and letting nature take its course on the ditch's natural restoration?
Yeah, I think so. We did not specifically study that. We're looking at areas where there's active ditch maintenance, but yeah.
Maybe we can eke in one more. Lori, you want to read the first one from Kathy?
Sure. What are your hypotheses for the old versus young carbon accumulation in the ditched versus the unditched areas? How does the rhizome in the root contribute to the carbon accumulation in each?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when we ran these samples for ramp pyrolysis oxidation, we actually sieved out the larger than 1 millimeter fraction of soil. So that would be removing those roots and rhizomes. So we're really looking at the smaller fine fraction of soil organic carbon. So that kind of answers the root rhizomes portion. The hypothesis of where this old organic carbon is coming from, we know that it has 13 C values of salt marsh organic matter. So we hypothesize that it might be microbial recycling that's just kind of spinning carbon at the surface of the marsh, resulting in this old carbon, or there's erosion of the salt marsh creek bank organic matter that's being redeposited on the surface of the salt marsh platform, that's resulting in contributions of old marsh material. And so both of these would be components that would be considered recycled organic carbon. And so the point that I want to make is, you know, if we're including this recycled material in, you know, carbon burial on an annual time scale, we're almost overestimating because there's this reused marsh component that is in the marsh platform.
Just a quick follow-up too, because I think we did go back and sieve out some of the cores to look at the coarse fraction too, right? Mm-hmm. And then you saw the changing in the percent of the root rhizome material with depth. Do you remember what those numbers were?
Yeah, it went from like 20% by weight to 10% at 30 centimeters and was like 1% by the time we got to like the 80 centimeter depth core. So that's kind of the distribution of the course fraction.
It looks like the first question is, do you think the ditch elevation model will work in a sediment-starved system? Did you ground truth the model in a very low SSC area?
So we use the Sage Lot Pond, which is on the other side of Cape Cod. It's lower sediment supply and is also lower tidal range. So the two factors were kind of together. And we got some predictions from there. It was not a full validation as for Barnstable. We only got some accretion rates in different areas, and those were consistent, or the model results for the small tidal range, small sediment supply was consistent with what we found in Sage Lot Pond. So I would say in general, the model should be applicable to a low sediment supply setting. In particular, the model showed that if you have a small tidal range and a small sediment supply, when the pond connects, they don't recover. So the pond, in order to recover, a pond needs to first connect to a channel, but then it also needs to accrete faster than the rate of sea level rise. And in a small tidal range, low sediment supply system, sometimes you don't get that. And when you connect to the channel, the ponds just keep lowering and widening. So there are some indication that this model works in low sediment supply system.
Okay, thanks, Giulio. Thanks for the question. Next question. With higher sea level rise, low tides will yield more puddling and perhaps accommodate more minnows and predators to feed on mosquito larvae. Do you think this is a fair speculation? Maybe
No.
that's a Gabby question.
I was gonna say it's going to all depend on the depth of the water
Okay.
and how low it goes at low tide.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Gabby, and thanks for the question. Next one, Lori.
Another question. This is an excellent model. What is the effect of Phragmites, or is there an effect?
That's for Amanda.
Well, we didn't actually go up as far into the upland where there, and there was actually more of a sort of a brush border along the, if you can see in Sharon's background there, along the sandy side. And then along more to the east, there was some Phragmites in the upland, but we didn't actually go that far in our transects. So our transects were only about 100 meters, and the marsh is much bigger than that. So we actually don't have good data on that.
Thanks for the question, and thanks for chiming in, Amanda. That's why this is a team effort. Lots of questions, lots of issues. Let's go to one from Jennifer. It seems like the model predicts infilling and almost natural reclamation of ditches with 0% maintenance. But is that what we are seeing today? The ditches I've observed seem to be expanding and widening even without maintenance. Not all, but definitely a large portion.
So that's a good question. I think a model can predict both depending on the sediment supply. So with a large sediment supply like in Barnstable, the ditch tends to fill in, and probably Gabby can support that's why they're maintaining the ditches, because they tend to slump in and fill in. Now, small tidal range, small sediment supply, this is the present day configuration. This is what is going to be predicted in the future. And you can see the ditches are not filling in. They're actually even slightly widening. And there is that bank slamping that I mentioned. It's in there. And if you can kind of focus on this part, this is kind of the model present day, and this is 2050 with 0% maintenance. You see they're widening. So it depends. The model can predict both options or both outcomes. And it's sediment supply mostly.
Okay. It looks like we have a question from Dominic on Long Island. Here on Long Island, in microbial areas where ditches are not maintained, we see an excessive pond formation and loss of vegetated areas. Your model predicts the opposite. Why?
So let me read it again. I see ditch are not maintained. We see excessive pond formation. So Long Island, probably the tidal range, I assume, is not very large. It's maybe like a meter. So I think it's this kind of similar simulation. So if tidal range is small, sediment supply is small, even if you don't maintain the ditches, I think you're talking about ditches that are not maintained. So this is present day, this is the future. You see the ponds are, the pond area is enlarging. So in general, when you are below that threshold where the ponds tends to recover, but actually when you're in that threshold, it doesn't really matter what you do. Yeah, the ponds are gonna keep expanding, whether or not you do ditching or not. In general, ditching for the ponds, it's only beneficial if there is enough sediment, because that's the ditches are gonna be facilitate the transfer of sediment and the recovery of the ponds. But if the system is such that ponds don't want to recover, making the ditch, because there is not enough sediment and sediment supply is large, the ditches are not going to help in that. If any, will do worse because they will do more subsidence by draining the marsh even more.
Okay. Thanks, Julio. Next question. This one is from Bill. Were the deposition of spoils on the marsh surface generated while maintaining ditches taken into account when modeling marsh elevation?
So no. So the sediment, it's kind of removed, which is, it seems somehow a unrealistic thing. But the other thing is to consider is that in this model, we are not conserving all the sediments. So for example, we impose the sediment concentration in the channel, which magically bring sediment to the system. So somehow these limitation of not considering where is the sediment removed from the ditches goes kind of pile up to the limitation of the model of not doing a complete sediment budget of the system. And theoretically, it could be done. It could be somehow spread around. My guess is that still it will not balance the subsidence caused by the ditches. And that's, for example, in Barnstable, we didn't observe a levee on the side of the ditches. I guess the sediment is spread enough that it doesn't really create a localized deposit. And that addition of sediment is not enough to overcome the subsidence effect. And that's why we see a lower elevation in the ditch area.
There's another comment here from Nicole. A point to keep in mind is that some of the elevation gain in shallow pans, when they're allowed to drain with runnel construction or breaks through ditch or channel levees, is also from vegetation regrowth, not only sediment supply.
Yeah. Again, in order to talk fast, I didn't mention that. When the pond recover, it can also start to grow vegetation, and then the contribution of vegetation, it's taken into account. Now, that being said, if the pond, when it's drained, it's below the threshold for vegetation grow, at the beginning, you cannot rely on organic accretion by plants to gain elevation. If you are below mean sea level rise, so a pond at the time of drainage is too low, it can only gain elevation by inorganic sediment. So only when you get, let's say, to mean sea level, then you start to accrete also by organic plant material. So really the bottleneck is getting to the point where you can regrow vegetation. And generally that is much more common in microtidal cases, because if you're in a large tidal range, the pond, even if it's 50 centimeters deep is probably going to be higher than mean sea level rise, mean sea level. So when it's drained, it's almost instantaneously revegetate. In a microtidal setting, if you have a 50 centimeters deep pond, the depth of the pond is probably below mean sea level. So when it connects to the channel, the vegetation doesn't want to grow. The only thing you can rely on is inorganic sediment, at least at the beginning.
This was a question from Joseph. Is the recovery of infill ponds linear based on the lead 210 data or episodic? That is from storm events.
Yeah, and like I said in the chat, the excess lead 210 profiles for the infilled recovered ponds were largely linear. We didn't see major nonlinear excess lead 210 profiles suggesting storm events or anything like that. So yeah.
And related to that thought, what rates of recovery were seen in the Great Barnstable Marsh ponds that were studied?
Yeah, so I'm assuming recovery rates as in accretion rates. We saw around like a 9 to 10 millimeter per year rate of accretion within the recovered ponds. And that was almost like double what we were seeing with the surrounding marsh.
Okay, thanks, Sharon. Lori, there is one there from R. Wolf. Do you want to take that one?
Sure. It would make sense that infilled ponds fill in more quickly as they may act as sinks to sediment. If these were natural features prior to ditching, you're actually losing that open water pool habitat type, something for managers to consider. I don't know if it's more of a comment or he wants looking for more information.
Yeah, I agree.
Julia,
well, I think I answered that. So it depends what you want to do. If you want to remove mosquitoes, you want to get rid of the ponds. If you want to manage wildlife, then you want to have more ponds. So it's the classic management trade-off. Well, one trade-off.
I'll go to another one from Rick Lathrop. Is there any indication that the ditched areas were originally Spartina patens dominated marsh? And would this affect the SOC differences?
Yeah, that's a good point. Amanda, I think you were about to answer.
I was gonna say, so Sharon's done, well, Sharon would definitely be able to talk about the data more closely than I can, but we're not able to tell that from the isotopes, the Del 13C data. My guess is that the ditched areas and the unditched areas were originally at a similar elevation. Yeah, so I'm just not sure we're able to tease the different species apart with the soil data we have, but my guess is that they would, both the ditched and unditched section would have been historically similar.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks for the question. Lori, go ahead, Julio.
This is a question from Jim Turek.
Yes.
So it says, it seems to me that the model is only assuming accretion in the ponds, when in fact the interior areas become more waterlogged, which results in marsh plant community stress, die-off, and then marsh platform erosion and subsidence. So the model doesn't just do accretion on the ponds, it does accretion everywhere. Again, the baseline is without ponds, without ditches, it's mostly the MEM evolution model, so organic accretion as a function of elevation, and then inorganic, the position depends on elevation and distance from the channel. So that is always present, and the result will be higher marsh will accrete less because of less organic accretion, less inorganic, and the lower the marsh, the ponds will accrete more. Then you have the ponds. When a pond is present, you don't have vegetation, and you don't even have sediments coming in because there is no connection from the channel. So an isolated pond doesn't get accretion and tends to deepen through time. And then when it's connected, it just accretes very fast. Mostly accrete as any other point, kind of according to the standard model, but because it's very low, it's going to accrete much faster than the nearby marsh that it's higher. At that point, it just becomes the standard way of evolving the model, and that includes the fact that lower places are faster than higher grounds.
Thanks, Julio. Lori, let's take one from Jim Rasman, just give different people a chance. We can get their questions in. Go ahead.
Okay, if the ditched areas end up with lower elevation, is it fair to say that ditching actually makes these areas become wetter over time?
I would say that the ditches are still enhancing that marsh platform drainage, which is what we were seeing with that well data. But I mean, with future sea level rise, I guess, because it's at a lower elevation, it'll maybe be more susceptible to inundation.
Currently, I think with your core data, the water percent of the soils was quite similar between the ditched and unditched areas. And so, yeah, it does seem that the ditches are quite effective at removing water from the platform.
It depends on the definition of wetter. So in terms of hydro period, the ditch area should have the larger hydro, I don't remember how it's defined, but it's gonna stay submerged slightly longer. But then a low tide, it might get rid more of the water, and the groundwater might be lower in the ditch area than in the high marsh area. So you will not have like standing water on top of the high marsh, but maybe the water table is just there. While in the ditch, you will have the water table dropping much more.
Do you think the infill ponds will reach the same elevation as the rest of the platform? And would that result in the platform having greater sediment accretion rates once the ponds are totally filled?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And so I think it's important to think about the timeline of this happening. So the ditches were installed around the 20s or 30s, and decades later, the ponds seem to have recovered in elevation, but are still slightly slower than the surrounding salt marsh. But yeah, that's an important consideration to make with ditching and pond recovery, is that we do have this fast recovery and now a vegetated marsh platform that is accreting organic biomass every year.
Thanks, Sharon.
Just to segue, so this is the model, the present day model elevation, and this is the model accretion. So you can see here the accretion, it's on the order of 10 millimeters per year. And these are places that it was a big pond that got connected, I don't know, recently, maybe 50 years ago. So the accretion is very high. And then this is, for example, is a still connected ponds here. And in the connected pond, the accretion is pretty much zero. And then you have the unponded area, which is at the accretion rate of 3 millimeters per year, which is kind of the standard accretion equal to rate of sea level rise rate. So there is all this variability, and again, depends on the time scale. This, if nothing change, this place eventually will get as high as the marsh, and then everything is gonna keep accreasing, and then you forget that there was a pond. Well, the pond is gonna be buried, the filled pond is gonna remain buried underneath, and then you'll have just new soil on top of it. But time scales are very important here.
Okay. Thanks, Julio. I'm checking the time, and I think we may be able to just eke in 2 more questions, and there's some really interesting ones and really important comments here too. So I just want to apologize up front if we don't get to one that you asked. As I promised, we will take these from the chat box and make sure some comments are given back to you. So bear with us. I'm going to jump around a bit and go back down to a question, a couple others, just to have different people get in a question who may haven't asked one before. And I'm going to take one from Rachel. Is there any historical information about why one section of the marsh was originally ditched and the other left unditched?
Maybe that's a question for Gabby.
The Gabby.
Sure. So I can see that Sue put in an answer. There was some farming that went on in the area. So that would impact where there are more ditches and where there weren't more ditches and where the ditches were located. But in general, when the ditches were put in, they were put in the areas where there was standing water to control mosquitoes. So it was all based on elevation. Places where the water was inundating and then leaving with the tides of the storms would not have had ditches put in. So it's sort of a combination of what went on for farming and what went on for mosquito control.